Hi everybody, I want to read to you an article written by Douglas Murray in The Spectator magazine, where he highlights some of the things that we're not talking about in regard to the Israel-Hamas war and the wider Middle East, but specifically with regard to Israel's fate and Israel's enemies. It's an important article because we must remember that the way that much of the media portrays this war, the way a lot of the hysteria is focused, is frankly biased, one-sided, and it's immoral or amoral. The obsession with the death count in Gaza, not much interest in how many of them are actually Hamas terrorists, and there actually is a very high terrorist to civilian ratio, as in it's so precise what Israel has managed to achieve, more precise than in any other urban warfare conflict. But Douglas, I'm going to read this out to you because he highlights some of the things that we're not talking about because we're too focused on all the anti-Israel rage. So let's have a listen to what he says, because I think these are some really important points. So here's what he says. The few inquiring minds still left occasionally ask me what the most underreported stories of the current Israel-Hamas conflict are. I tend to reply that there are two. The first is the issue of Israeli refugees. By the way, what about the hostages as well? It's funny how I feel like there's a really disproportionate lack of attention on the hostages. There's still over 100 plus hostages still in Gaza. It's, as Douglas said in a previous video that we referenced, he knew as soon as October 7th happened that within a day minds would move to the Israeli response and just criticizing that. Anyway, the first issue, as he said, is the Israeli refugees. They are not called that inside Israel, where the authorities prefer to refer to them as internally displaced people. These are refugees who, whether in the south, on the border with Gaza, or in the north, on the border with Lebanon, have had to retreat and become refugees in more central parts of Israel because of the danger that they're facing. People aren't talking about that. People don't need to be interested in that outside of Israel. But while the world rightly concerns itself with the internally displaced people inside Gaza, the lack of notice paid to this other story is strange, Douglas says. For the past 5 months, tens of thousands of Israeli families have had to abandon their homes. After 7th of October, people in villages, towns and cities near the Gaza border were immediately moved out by the Israeli government, mainly to hotels around the Dead Sea and Eilat. So they're also in even further south as well. At the same time, tens of thousands of families from the north of the country are forced to leave their homes because of the threat of bombardment and invasion by Hezbollah on the border Israel shares with Lebanon. I've lived among these people for many months, and their misery seems to have bypassed most of the international media. Let me give an example. The 22,000 residents of Kiryat Shmona in the north were evacuated to Tel Aviv from their homes on 7th of October. Most have not been back. Their city's proximity to the Lebanon border means that not only is it at risk of ground attack, it is also an exceptionally close rocket range to Hezbollah. I have been there a number of times in recent months. It is deserted, of course, although there is one quite good kebab shop open which serves the few people who go that way. When the rockets come, you can see why it's no longer possible to live in this city. Even the siren systems, which Israel, unlike Hamas, has invested in, can't do their job effectively. A couple of rockets will land, you hear the booms. A couple of beats and then the sirens will go off. Having been there for months, I can tell you that although these displaced people's lives may be better than those of the citizens in Hamas-run Gaza, it isn't much fun. It might be fun to live with your family in a hotel room for a week. It isn't much fun to do so for months, let alone indefinitely. It is life on hold with children missing their education. Some people have returned to the south. The success of the operation in Gaza means that rocket fire into towns such as Sderot is now only occasional. Only occasional. How lucky. Still, it requires a considerable amount of courage to move back. One woman in her 70s I got to know had tried several times to return home. She had heard the terrorists going past her apartment on 7th of October and had two disadvantages. She lives alone and she lives on the ground floor. Ground floor apartments in areas like Sderot that Hamas invaded are not prime real estate these days. Nevertheless, she recently summoned up the courage to return and to try to continue with her life. The residents of the north are not so lucky. While Hamas may have been significantly degraded in Gaza, which you can also tell from the fact that what used to be daily sirens in Tel Aviv are now a monthly affair, Hezbollah's arsenal of perhaps 160,000 rockets remains sitting on the Lebanon border. They are of a higher quality than Hamas rockets, longer range and far more deadly. If Hamas was Iran's Ford Cortina, Hezbollah is its Lamborghini. And there is the question of when Iran wants to use them. It might use them any day, or it might be waiting until the regime in Tehran is on the brink of its long sought-after nuclear bomb and can then use Hezbollah as a deterrent against any Israeli or American strike. Which brings me to my second unreported fact, and I hope you've had your breakfast before digesting this. I was on the Lebanon border 18 years ago during the 2006 war with Israel. I well remember the shelling and the firing. Seeing the activity there in recent months, where it is much more heated than either side wants to admit, has persuaded me of something. The war in the Middle East has not yet begun, or at least what we have seen in Gaza is merely an opening skirmish. No country could cope with significant swathes of its population being permanently displaced from their homes, but what the world outside the region seems not to realise is that Gaza is a sideshow. The real showdown in the region will be with Tehran. The 2006 conflict came to a halt because the UN Security Council passed a resolution, 1701, which assured peace with the promise that Hezbollah would not be permitted to rebuild its arsenal on Israel's border. Since people are very keen on UN resolutions, it mystifies me that they never bothered to enforce this one. Perhaps it is the case that the UN needn't abide by all its resolutions. If you stand in a deserted town like Metula right on the Lebanon border, you can see Hezbollah outposts everywhere, including observation posts. The other week, I went into a hotel there that had been bombed the day before and was told to get out because Hezbollah could see that my cameraman and I had gone in and they were likely to shell it again. Camera footage from the day before showed a UN peacekeeping vehicle leaving its base along the border. Hezbollah fired off a barrage of rockets into Israel as they do with some regularity, and the UN vehicle simply did a U-turn and returned to base. That isn't peacekeeping, it's war watching. So, since the international community doesn't abide by its own resolutions and has allowed Hezbollah to rearm, it seems that it will be left to Israel to do what is needed to allow its citizens to return home, and that's not possible solely from the air. I hate to be the harbinger of bad news, or war, but the Middle East war has not begun. Everything so far has been a prelude. I think what Douglas, one of the points that he's getting at that needs to be appreciated is that it is so morally bankrupt that we have so many people throughout the world acting as if Israel is the great aggressor here. And it's all just mighty Israel. And they're responding and over the top, as President Biden said. It is so important that people realize, just zoom out a tiny bit, and you'll see it's a tiny sliver of land in the Middle East surrounded by so many dozens of Arab and Muslim states. And yet they can't just have one little tiny Israel, a Jewish state. And this whole idea of, well, what about the Palestinians? The whole concept was made up in order to destroy Israel. They just want to be part. All the Palestinian leaders, past and present, have said they just want greater Arab unity. They're Arabs. And you know what, as Arabs, you have plenty of place to live. And by the way, they're welcome to live in Israel, but it's Jewish. It's a Jewish state. And they're going to have to, as Loay al-Sharif said, an Arab Muslim peace activist, they're going to need to go through some kind of reform to accept the fact that God gave this land to the Jewish people. Under international law, it's also the Jewish state, according to the rules of indigeneity, historically, biblically, however, which way you want to look at it. But I prefer to, in the world of the Middle East, use religious language. And I think that's what God is actually calling upon us to say to them, that this is our land by divine right, as an eternal inheritance that he promised to our forefathers, biological ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But I think what Douglas is saying is important. It's so important to realize that really Israel is actually the underdog. And it is a perversion, the way that it's portrayed, when Israel defends herself on the world stage, to say that Israel is somehow the aggressor here, when they face the worst attack on Jews since the Holocaust and are, with the most precise military operations, targeting these modern-day Nazis of Hamas. Douglas talks about war. We as Jews hope and pray and believe that with a combination of physical effort and also spiritual effort, we can avert crisis and more bloodshed and more difficulty by being strong as a nation, both, as I say, through physical might and also through spiritual might. If we do that, we already know that our future is bright. As Rabbi Jonathan Sachs said, the Jewish people's golden age has always been in the future. But we do believe that we have the ability to avoid more turbulence than perhaps we've seen to date. And that is through that double-pronged approach of both physical and spiritual resilience. So let's hope that Douglas, on this one issue, isn't actually right, but of course he is being a fair and objective observer of what's happening, and frankly has been a real advocate for not just Israel, but for the truth of the situation. I think I heard him once saying, I don't get it, I'm just sort of saying what's right, what is the truth, and the truth how I see it, and it's almost sad that has to be some kind of great accolade, but it is, and we thank you, Douglas, for helping people to understand the truth of the situation in the region. I'm Molly Annisfeld, and you're watching JTV.